The observer as defined as the resonant instance in the foundational thesis, life, the observer, and consciousness, one and the items through the structural coupling emerged between it, and the environment offers a framework of a new ontological category as software-physicalism. On the other hand, the free energy principle, FEP, which tries to offer a unifying account of biological self-organization through the minimization of variational free energy, formalized via Markov blankets and predictive coding architectures, stands within the ontological position aforementioned, under slight critique points. While powerful in its formal reach, this framework presupposes an epistemic stance wherein agents are modeled as inference engines operating over hidden states, as if from a tabula rasa perspective of the system. In this paper, I propose a critique and extension of this paradigm through the lens of the symbols framework, which reframes the locus of adaptive behavior not in probabilistic inference, but in structural coupling and observer resonance. I argue that organisms are not blank models estimating the world, but embodied systems imprinted by environmental structure, bearing folded histories that encode past interactions and decode present affordances through generative enactment. Here, meaning does not arise through inferential approximation, but through closures which are part of the system itself, physicalist. The completion of symbols, defined as structured resonances between the system and its niche, operating across what I term as the Symboliad, as opposed to Eliade, as expressed in the original thesis. This framework dispenses with the notion of hidden states, replacing them with direct, basin-mediated synchrony between the organism and its environment.
Okay, let's unpack this deep dive. Think about something simple, like a chair.
Okay.
How do you know it's a chair? I mean, what if you're just feeling it in a dark room?
Right.
Or seeing it from some weird angle where it doesn't even look like a chair? How much is your perception, your understanding of that thing?
Yeah.
How much does it depend on you physically doing something?
Like reaching out to touch it or walking around it?
Exactly. Walking around to get a better view. And what if? What if the picture is even bigger? What if perception isn't just about what you do?
That question, it seems so fundamental, right?
Yeah.
We open our eyes or touch something and boom, we perceive it. We get it.
Yeah.
But the actual process, how raw sensory input and interaction actually build up into stable, meaningful perception, how we make sense of the world, that's one of the deepest puzzles out there, really, in science, philosophy.
Absolutely. And the source material we're diving into today offers a genuinely radical framework for tackling that puzzle. It proposes a whole new way to think about perception, about where meaning comes from, and maybe even what agency really means.
Yeah, the paper is by C. Stephan. It's titled Coherence Across Scales, Bridging Sensory Substitution and Perceptual Agency via Software-physicalism within the Symbols Framework.
It's a bit of a mouthful, yeah. But trust us, the ideas inside are incredibly insightful and, frankly, pretty mind-bending.
Definitely.
So our mission in this deep dive is to guide you through this framework. We're going to zero in on the absolute core concepts, show you why they challenge some really established ideas.
Yeah, some big ones.
Walk through some surprising experimental evidence that seems to support them, and ultimately explore how this thing called structured coherence might be the real key to meaning itself.
And the paper does introduce some new terminology, definitely. But we're going to break it down clearly, piece by piece.
Think of us as your navigators through this this intellectual landscape. We'll highlight the spots where it gets really interesting.
That's good.
Exactly. And, before we jump into the new framework itself, it's probably helpful to understand the landscape it's emerging from. Many modern views in cognitive science, like, say, the enactive approach, ecological psychology, predictive processing,
right,
they've already moved past that old idea of the brain as just a computer passively processing information.
Right. They see organisms and their environments as locked in this constant dynamic dance interaction. The paper calls it structural coupling, which is a concept from Maturana and Varela.
Okay.
It's the idea that through ongoing interaction, both the organism and the environment change together. They mutually shape each other.
And that's a huge shift, right? I mean, perception isn't just happening inside your head. It's something you're actively doing with the world. But, and here's where our source material identifies a really significant gap. Even these dynamic views often don't fully explain how. How does stable meaning, how does a consistent sense of self or agency actually emerge from that endless dance of interaction?
Yeah, how does that continuous back and forth, that structural coupling, give rise to something solid enough to perceive a chair consistently, or to feel like you were the one doing the perceiving and the acting?
Exactly.
The paper argues there's Well, there's a missing layer, a missing piece in the puzzle of how interaction actually becomes meaning.
Okay, so we have the puzzle. Dynamic interaction becoming stable meaning. And this is where C. Stephan's symbols framework steps in with its proposed solution. And the first crucial piece of that solution is something called the basin.
The basin. Okay. The paper describes it as this necessary intermediary layer. It's not purely inside the organism like in your brain, and it's not purely outside in the environment.
So where is it then?
Think of it as a kind of, like a soft interface or maybe a catalytic field right there in the space between the environment and the physical body.
Okay, like a meeting point.
Sort of. It's where the hardware, your physical body, your sensory apparatus, all that embodied infrastructure meets the software.
The software being?
The dynamic processes, the patterns of energy and information coming from the world, they kind of fuse in this basin substrate.
Interesting. Fusing hardware and software.
And here's a really critical point, according to the source. The basin doesn't require you, the agent, to deliberately initiate movement or action for things to start happening there.
Okay, so it can be passive.
It just needs coherent input, coherent patterns of interaction, whether they come from you moving or from something moving. You can start triggering processes in this basin. It doesn't necessarily matter if they were self-initiated or passively received, as long as they have that coherent structure.
Okay, so the basin is the place, the substrate, where interaction inputs can start to coalesce, to build up.
Exactly.
And what emerges from this basin when there's enough coherent input?
That brings us to the core units of this framework, symbols.
Symbols, okay.
And this is where we really need to be clear to emphasize what these symbols are not. They are explicitly not representations in the way cognitive science usually talks about them. Meaning they aren't like little pictures or words stored in your brain that stand for something else out in the world. The framework argues that kind of representation is a much later development, if it happens at all in that way.
Right. So if they aren't mental pictures, what are these symbols then?
The source describes them as field-like structures, kind of like persistent patterns of resonance. Imagine ripples on a pond that stabilize into a specific shape for a moment.
Okay.
But they're made of the water's dynamic movement, not some solid object dropped in. Symbols are like that, but arising from the interaction dynamics in the basin.
So patterns of activity.
Yes, structured residues of prior interactions.
Yeah.
They emerge through patterned resonance in the basin. The paper talks about them as soft oscillatory coherence.
Soft coherence.
And this is a major claim. The framework proposes that these symbols actually precede what we typically think of as thought.
Whoa, okay, so meaning comes before thought.
In this view, yes. Resonant structure, the formation of these stable resonant patterns, is the origin of meaning. Not some internal calculation or representation being manipulated.
And you said they're cross-modal.
Right. They function as what the paper calls cross-modal stabilized closures. That means they are units of meaning, these resonant patterns, that can persist across different senses.
So the same symbol could be triggered by seeing something, or touching it, or even hearing about it.
Exactly. As long as the input, regardless of the sense modality, carries the right coherent structure to trigger that specific resonant pattern, that symbol, they encapsulate the outcome, the stabilized pattern of past engagements.
Okay, that's a big concept. Symbols as resonant, cross-modal patterns of meaning.
And these individual symbols, they don't just exist in isolation. They form this vast interconnected network. And the paper gives this network a name, the Symboliad.
The Symboliad, like a galaxy of symbols.
Sort of. Think of it as the vast, ever-evolving landscape of potential meaning, formed by this huge web of interrelated symbols. It's the structured, non-representational, but meaning-enabling layer.
Okay.
It's the software coherence, as the paper puts it, that spans different levels or scales of interaction.
Software coherent, that connects to the next idea, doesn't it? This software-physicalism.
It does, yeah. To explain this symbol-forming, meaning-generating reality, the paper introduces this new ontological category, software-physicalism.
Okay, ontology. So we're talking about the nature of reality itself.
Exactly. It's trying to find a middle ground, a bridge between traditional physicalism, which often feels too reductive, boiling everything down to just inert particles and force.
We're losing the meaning.
And on the other side, something like panpsychism, which posits consciousness or mind is fundamental everywhere, which can feel a bit too, metaphysical for some.
So what's the middle ground?
Software-physicalism views the physical world not as just dead matter, but as something the source calls a dynamically responsive soft areal.
A soft area.
Meaning it's a physical substrate, it's definitely physical, but it has this fundamental capacity built in for forming coherent structures, the symbols, through dynamic interaction and resonance.
So the potential for meaning for these patterns is inherent in the physical stuff itself.
That's the idea. Meaning doesn't just pop into existence out of nowhere or get computed abstractly. It arises inherently through resonance and coherence within this soft physical reality.
An embodiment, then. What is that in this view?
Embodiment isn't just about owning a body like a container. It's about being a point of participation, a site of resonance within this broader coherence field. It acknowledges physical reality, but emphasizes the crucial role of dynamic patterns and resonance in how meaning emerges.
Okay, wow. That's a lot to take in. So we've got the basin as the catalytic space, symbols as the emergent patterns of meaning,
Right.
the Symboliad as the vast web they form,
Yep.
and software-physicalism as the view of reality that supports all this.
You got it.
Okay. So how does this whole framework, how does it change how we think about perception? And maybe even more surprisingly, agency.
Right. Well, for perception, in this framework, it isn't just about enacting the world through your own embodied action, which some enactive views really emphasize.
Which we talked about earlier, the structural coupling idea.
Exactly. Instead, perception arises more fundamentally from the coherence between the structured input coming from the environment and the organism's capacity to form relevant symbols by resonating with those patterns.
So it's about the match, the resonance.
Yes. And the paper defines the observer here in a specific way, not just the acting body, but as a resonant instance, a system that's attuned to its specific environmental niche.
Yeah.
So perception becomes stable when there's stable resonance happening within the Symboliad, matching that coherent input from the outside.
Okay, that makes sense. Stability through resonance. But what about agency, that feeling of me doing something?
Ah, yes. Agency. This is where it gets really fascinating and maybe quite counterintuitive for a lot of us.
How so?
Agency, that sense of you doing something deliberately, is seen here as, well, contingent and distributed. It emerges through symbols and the observer dynamic we just talked about.
It emerges through them, not causing them.
It's not seen as solely a top-down command tied to your voluntary action. The framework suggests that what feels like agency is enacted when a coherent cascade of symbols gets triggered and stabilizes.
Okay.
And crucially, that trigger could be your voluntary action, yes, but it could also be purely structured interaction with the environment, even if the motion isn't initiated by you.
Wait, so I could feel like I'm acting even if something else moved me as long as the input was structured correctly?
Potentially, yes. Or rather, the feeling of agency might arise differently than we assume. This is the really mind-bending part. The paper suggests that the feeling of acting or having a specific intention might actually emerge, kind of retrospectively.
Retrospectively, like after it happened.
Sort of. After the relevant symbols have formed and stabilized, completing a kind of coherent rounding or closure process. So agency isn't necessarily the prerequisite cause for symbols forming. But maybe it's more like something that shapes or refines how you explore the Symboliad later. It helps refine your attunement, maybe modulates the exploration, rather than being the initial spark.
So agency isn't the driver, it's more like a consequence or a modulator emerging from the interaction itself.
That seems to be the implication. It's distributed across the whole interaction loop, the sensoromotor coherence, and the symbol formation, rather than originating solely from an internal decision or motor command firing off before anything happens.
Wow. Okay, that definitely challenges our intuitive sense of cause and effect when it comes to our own actions.
It really does. And this is where the empirical evidence becomes so important, because it provides some concrete examples that seem to support this, well, pretty counterintuitive view, particularly experiments in sensory substitution and embodiment illusions.
Okay, let's hear about those. You mentioned sensory substitution.
Yeah, but one study highlighted in the paper by S. Akar and colleagues used a device that converts visual shapes into tactile and auditory feedback. So imagine someone is learning to see shapes, but they're doing it through patterns they feel on their hand and sounds they hear.
Okay, I can picture that.
The really clever part was a double participant setup. One person actively moved their hand, holding the device, over the shapes, getting the touch and sound feedback, normal learning.
Right.
But A second person had their hand moved passively. Their hand was connected to a pantograph, like a drawing duplicator, that perfectly copied the first person's hand movements.
So they got the exact same input sequence.
Exactly the same sequence of touch and sound feedback, moving over the same shapes in the same way, but they weren't controlling the motion at all. Their hand was just being moved for them.
Okay, so what happened? Did the passive person learn?
That's the kicker. Both groups, the active movers and the passive movers, learned to perceive the shapes accurately. They both showed significant improvement in identifying shapes through this non-visual feedback.
Really? Even without intending the movement?
Yes. It didn't matter whether they were initiating the movement or just having their hand moved for them, as long as the sensory input itself was structured and coherent over time.
Wow. That's powerful evidence then. It suggests perception isn't strictly dependent on the voluntary motor command, like some theories would emphasize.
Exactly. It supports the framework's idea that structured sensory input, the kind of coherent patterns that would activate the basin and trigger symbol formation, was sufficient for perceptual learning. The Symboliad can be engaged, meaning can emerge, even when the action is externally driven, without that conscious volitional agency driving it.
Okay, that's one line of evidence. What about the embodiment illusions?
Right. Another classic example that fits really well with these ideas comes from body transfer illusions. The most famous is probably the rubber hand illusion.
Ah, yes, I've heard of that one. The fake hand feels real.
Exactly. You hide someone's real hand from their view, and you place a realistic-looking rubber hand where they can see it, positioned plausibly. Then you use two brushes and stroke the fake rubber hand and the person's hidden real hand at the same time, in the same way, synchronously.
Right, the synchronous stroking is key.
It is. And very quickly, most people start to feel that the rubber hand is actually part of their own body. They feel the touch on the rubber hand. Some even react with surprise or distress if the experimenter suddenly hits the fake hand with a hammer.
Which is wild because logically they know it's not their hand.
Absolutely. But the perceptual coherence, the visual input of the stroking on the fake hand, perfectly matching the tactile input on their real hidden hand, is so strong, it overrides that logical knowledge.
So how does the symbols framework explain this?
Well, according to the framework, this demonstrates beautifully how the sense of embodiment and even a kind of temporary agency or ownership over the hand can be enacted purely through external consistency and coherence.
It's the pattern again.
Yes. The basin receives this highly coherent visual tactile input pattern. This coherent input triggers symbols related to body ownership, wholeness, maybe even vulnerability within the Symboliad. And the result is you feel the fake hand is yours.
So it's not about biological connection, it's about the coherent data stream activating the right symbols.
Precisely. It shows this symbol-forming process is central to our sense of self and our body boundaries, and it can be driven by coherent input patterns, not necessarily by direct biological continuity or even voluntary action directed at the fake hand.
Okay, so these experiments, both the passive sensory substitution and the rubber hand illusion, they provide pretty tangible support for the framework's claims. Structured coherence is fundamental, and symbol formation leading to perception, embodiment, even agency can occur without traditional volition.
Yeah, they really challenge the necessity of self-initiated action for these core aspects of experience to arise.
Right. Okay, let's zoom out a bit now. How does this framework connect to some of the really big questions in cognitive science, neuroscience, philosophy? You mentioned the binding problem earlier.
Ah, yes, the binding problem.
Yeah.
It's a classic puzzle in neuroscience. How do all the separate features we perceive, like the color red, the round shape, the bouncing motion, the squeaking sound of a ball,
Yeah.
how do they all get integrated or bound together into a single unified experience of that specific ball?
Yeah, traditional neuroscience kind of struggles to find a single spot in the brain where all this binding magically happens, right?
Exactly. Where's the binding center? The symbols framework offers a totally different perspective. It suggests binding isn't a separate problem that needs to be solved by some specific mechanism or brain area.
Oh. So what is it then?
It's more like a side effect of symbols emergence.
A side effect.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Remember, symbols are described as these latent closures of prior complex structural engagements. They're the stabilized resonant patterns that emerge from coherent interaction. So when a symbol forms, it inherently carries this integrated information because it emerged from a coherent, multimodal input pattern in the basin in the first place. It's not like separate features are floating around needing to be glued together by something else.
Ah, I see.
The symbol is the bound unit of meaning that emerged from that coherent multimodal input. The binding happens in the formation of the symbol itself through resonance.
So the feeling of unity, of self even, isn't just sticking bits together. It's more like a sustained resonance.
That's how the paper frames it,
Yeah.
A sustained lived resonance within the Symboliad, enacted through these closures. Binding is inherent in the resonance structure.
It's a very different way to look at it. What about evolution? Does the framework touch on that?
It does, briefly. It hints that maybe evolution wasn't just selecting for organisms with bigger or better internal thinking machines in the classical computational sense.
Okay. What was it selecting for them?
Instead, perhaps evolution primarily favored the capacity for organisms, even very simple ones, to form and leverage symbols. That is, the ability to resonate with and stabilize crucial relationship patterns with their environment.
So being better at picking up and locking onto meaningful environmental coherences.
Exactly. It resonates, excuse the pun, with ideas like basal cognition, seeing cognitive capacities even in systems without complex brains, like plants or single-celled organisms. It suggests this resonance-based coupling, this symbol formation, might be a more fundamental biological principle than what we usually call thinking or representation.
Interesting. Okay, and now, you mentioned something earlier that sounded particularly out there. Retrocausality, time.
Ah, yes. This is where it gets potentially the most mind-bending, stepping into the framework's view on time and what it calls functional retrocausality.
Okay, brace myself. Functional retrocausality, what does that mean?
The paper proposes a pretty radical idea, that when symbols close or stabilize in the present moment through resonance in the base, they don't just structure our perception and potential actions going forward. They can also, in a sense, retroactively reshape the Symboliad itself, and thus the veil of meaning we experience, extending back into what we perceive as the past.
Whoa, wait. Reshape the past? How is that possible? It sounds like time travel.
It's crucial to understand this isn't suggesting physical cause and effect is reversed. It's not saying you can, send a signal back in time to change a physical event that already happened.
Okay, good. That would break physics.
Right. It's described as a functional retrocausality. It's a retroactive structuring of the meaning or the coherence within the Symboliad.
Okay, structuring the meaning of the past, not the physical events themselves. How does that work?
The idea is that the meaning of past events or past configurations isn't rigidly fixed. It's malleable, depending on the current state of the Symboliad. So a new symbol formed now, based on current coherent input, can resonate back through the interconnected web of the Symboliad. And in doing so, it can create a new kind of coherence, a new pattern of relationships within that web that wasn't there before. This effectively reshapes how the past is integrated into the current overall field of meaning.
So my understanding or the significance of something that happened years ago could actually change based on a symboli form right now.
That's the implication. The Symboliad acts as this vast patterned veil of meaning, and when a symbol is enacted now via resonance in the basin, it binds coherently across scales, not just projecting into the future, but also resonating backward within the existing structure of meaning, enacting the coherent narrative that we interpret as the flow of time. The past's meaning isn't fixed until a present symbol resonates back through it.
That is. Wow. It ties into how we constantly reinterpret our memories, doesn't it?
It does seem to offer a mechanism for that, yeah. And the paper connects it, perhaps speculatively, to ideas in quantum physics, where the act of observation seems weirdly entangled with the structure of space-time itself.
The observer effect.
Sort of, yeah. And also to philosophy, like maybe Lacan or Wittgenstein, where meaning is seen as enacted through shared structures, shared forms of life, and where paradoxes show the boundaries of coherence. The past is constantly being rewritten by the present enactment of meaning.
Okay. That's definitely a lot to chew on. It seems like the symbols framework is trying to build a really broad synthesis then.
I think that's fair to say, yeah. It's drawing connections across philosophy, biology, cognitive science, neuroscience, and even pointing towards potential new directions for things like AI.
And the core shift is moving meaning-making away from just being in the head or in the action.
And locating it in this dynamic interplay between structured environmental input, the body's resonant capacity, its fitness to its niche, and this symbol-forming basin.
Using this language of software-physicalism to talk about how structured coherence emerges across different scales of reality.
Exactly. Meaning isn't something we compute internally. It's something we resonate with and enact through these emergent symbolic patterns.
Okay, so let's try and bring this back down to earth a bit. How does this radical reframing of perception, agency, even time, how does this matter to you listening right now?
Well, think about it. If perception isn't just about your voluntary action, but maybe more fundamentally about receiving and resonating with structured input. How might that change how you think about learning something new?
Maybe it's less about just grinding out deliberate practice steps over and over.
And maybe more about finding the right kind of structured environment, finding the right patterns to expose yourself to so you can resonate with them and build those crucial symbols more effectively.
Or think about skill acquisition, mastering a complex skill, like playing an instrument or a sport. Is it just about perfecting the motor commands?
Or is it more fundamentally about developing a really refined capacity to attune to and resonate with the specific, subtle, domain-relevant Symboliad structures, those patterns of coherence that actually define what mastery looks like in that skill?
Yeah, feeling the flow, knowing the next move without thinking.
Exactly. And think about our interactions with technology, especially things like advanced sensory prosthetics, or maybe even sophisticated AI systems.
Okay.
If coherent input is the key to perception and meaning, potentially regardless of who or what initiated the action part, well, that opens up really interesting possibilities for designing systems that leverage this fundamental process of symbol formation, doesn't it? Creating new ways for us, or maybe even for AI, to make sense of complex data streams.
The core shift really feels profound. It's not just about internal computation. It's not just about external action.
It's about finding and enacting coherent patterns through resonance within this software physical space.
It suggests there's a deeper, maybe more fundamental process underlying how we experience reality and make sense of it all.
So just to recap the journey we've taken in this deep dive, we explored C. Stephen's symbols framework,
Right.
introducing the crucial role of the basin as the catalytic space where interactions meet.
Then symbols as the emergent, resonant units of meaning themselves. Not representations, but patterns.
Exactly. And the Symboliad is the vast, interconnected web they form, the landscape of potential meaning.
And underpinning it all, this idea of software-physicalism as a way to think about reality itself having this capacity for resonant structure.
Yeah, that's the core architecture.
And the absolute key takeaway here, I think, is that perception and meaning emerge from structured coherence and resonance.
And critically, the empirical evidence we looked at, from passive sensory substitution, the rubber hand illusion, it strongly suggests this core process can happen even without traditional volitional agency being the driver.
Which really sets the stage for our final provocative thought for you to ponder.
If our subjective sense of agency, that intimate feeling of us being the one calling the shots, the one doing something, if that might actually emerge after a symbol cascade stabilizes.
Kind of like a story we tell ourselves after the coherent pattern forms.
And if our very understanding of the past, the meaning we ascribe to events long gone, can be functionally, retroactively reshaped by the symbols we form right now, in the present, based on current resonance.
What does that truly mean for our deeply held intuitions about concepts like free will, or even about the objective fixed reality of time as we usually experience it?
And maybe looking forward. If meaning fundamentally arises from these resonance patterns, from enacting coherence, how might this perspective completely transform how we approach building artificial intelligence, or how we understand the cognitive capacities of seemingly non-conscious systems, from simple organisms to complex ecosystems? What kind of coherent patterns could we or future AIs potentially learn to resonate with to unlock entirely new forms of understanding and meaning?